The champion's aide was halfway through reading my name to the mess hall when I came back with my second tray, so I stood at the end of the table and let him finish. He was doing a voice. I don't know what a human accent sounds like to a Cossack, but apparently it sounds like a slow leak from a pressure valve, because that was the noise he was making, and 3 tables of garrison troops were laughing hard enough to rattle their cutlery. Calder, the aide read again, tapping the entry slate with one polished claw. Wesley Calder, occupation, cargo handler, deck 6, species, human. He let it hang the way a comic lets a punchline hang. Declared event, the 9 burdens, all 9. The laugh that came off those tables had real body to it. A Valyri trooper at the far end laughed so hard he had to fold himself in half, which for a Valyri is a production, since they run about 3 meters tall and most of it is neck. Somebody slapped the table. Somebody else made the slow leak noise back at the aide, and the two of them traded it back and forth like a song. I sat down and started on the stew. The garrison mess on Sessenring serves actual protein, not the printed paste they feed us down on the freight decks, and I had 20 days of it coming to me, so I wasn't going to let it go cold over a joke. The aide noticed me about the time I noticed the stew had real marrow in it. His eye stalks came around, then his whole armored bulk, plates clicking as he turned. The mess went quiet in that way rooms do when the joke walks in and sits down with the audience. "You are the human?" he said. "One of them," I said. "There's about 40 of us on the ring. You are the human on this list." "That's me." He looked at the slate. He looked at me. "I am 54 years old. I stand 1.78 m in deck boots. And after 30 years of cargo work, I am built less like a statue and more like a hand truck. Functional, a little dented, wider at the base than the manufacturer intended." The aide took all of this in with the expression of someone checking a manifest against a crate and finding the numbers wrong. "The 9 burdens," he said, "is the garrison's oldest event. The yoke at the 9th burden masses more than you do." "I read the rules sheet," I said. "Good stew." That was the whole conversation, but it was enough to bring the big one over. I heard him before I saw him. A Cossack the size of a cargo lifter doesn't cross a room quietly, and then garrison champion Vrelik was standing across the table from me, blocking the light from 2 ceiling panels at once. I'd seen him on the feeds. Everyone on Sessenring had. 2.5 meters of layered shell, the color of wet slate, claws he kept polished to a shine, and a banner of rank scales down one shoulder that meant he hadn't lost an event in 11 cycles. He held the record on the 9 burdens. 7 full burdens and a third of the 8th, set twice, never approached by anyone else. They said the authority had to recast the trophy because he'd won it so many times the engraving plate ran out of room. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached out very deliberately and picked up my arm by the wrist the way you'd pick up a tool you suspected was broken. He turned it over. He inspected the elbow. He set it back down next to the tray, neatly like he was returning it to stock. "Soft," he announced to the room. "Soft all the way through. There is no shell on it anywhere." He leaned down so his eye stalks were level with my face, and I will say this for him, he had a sense of theater. "Little handler, do you know what happens to a body under the 9th burden?" "I figure it gets heavy," I said. The room broke up again. Vrelik straightened, satisfied, and raised one claw for quiet, and got it instantly, which told you something about who ran the social order in that mess. "I will make a kindness of this," he said. "A wager open to the room. Name the burden where the human sets down the yoke." He clacked the claw shut with a sound like a bolt seating. "I say the second. I am being generous. I am counting the first as a gift to his species." They started shouting numbers before he finished. Most said the first burden. A few optimists said the second. The Valyri with the long neck called out the weighing ceremony, meaning I'd failed before the event even started, and that got the biggest laugh of the night. I finished the stew. There was a fruit course after, something dense and purple that the Kazakh troops cracked open with their claws. The cook saw me struggling with it and lent me a deck knife, and I ate that too, while the wagers climbed, and the slow leak impression made its 3rd and 4th appearances. Then I boozed my tray, nodded to the cook, and went back down to deck 6 for the tail half of my shift. I want to be clear about something, because the feeds got it wrong later and never corrected it. I did not enter the garrison games to prove anything. I did not enter because of human pride, or to answer an insult, or because of anything anyone said about our species in a mess hall. I entered 11 days before that dinner in a fee office on the administrative deck for 2 reasons, and I gave both of them to the clerk when he asked. The clerk was an Anise, which on Sessenring means civil service the way water means wet. Subadjudicator Pemmel, gray as a filing cabinet, wearing a vest with more stamps hanging off it than I had teeth. He'd summoned me because of Article 40 of the Garrison Games Charter, a rule nobody had read in years. Any registered heavy tonnage handler on the station rolls must be extended an invitation to the strength events. The authority's tonnage ledger had flagged my lift totals automatically, 30 years of cargo decks adds up to a number that looks impressive if you don't know it happened one crate at a time, and the invitation was a formality. Pemmel had a decline form already filled out. He had it stamped. He just needed me to touch the slate. Every cycle we flag 2 or 3 of you, he said, not unkindly. Humans always decline. The form takes a moment. What's this line here? I asked. The entrant provisions. He looked at where I was pointing, and his gray face did something I would later learn was an Onese frown, which is the same as an Onese smile but slower. Entrants receive the training provision, relief from contracted shifts for the 20-day preparation period at full pay, a stipend at the hazard rate, and a meal allowance at the garrison mess for the duration of the games. I did the arithmetic standing there at his counter. The stipend at hazard rate came to a little over 4 months of dock pay. 4 months of dock pay was, give or take, the cost of the engine, the bright work, and the last of the planking for the boat. I should explain the boat, since everything that happened on Sessenring eventually ran into it. I have a shed on Earth, on a lake in a part of the world where the winters mean something, and in that shed is a hull I have been building for 9 years, a little at a time, between contracts, cedar on oak. When my contract on the ring ends, I am going to go home, finish her, and put her in the water, and that is the entire plan for the rest of my life. Everything I do out here is in service of that shed. I'll enter, I said. Pemmel's stamps all swung at once as he sat up. The event roster requires a declared event. Which one pays the stipend longest? He consulted the slate. The 9 burdens carries the full provision. It is the closing event. That one, then. He looked at me the way the aide would later look at me. Manifest against crate. Then something happened in his face that I want on the record, because Pemmel was the first one, before any of it. He did not laugh. He pulled a fresh form, hand-inked my name onto it in 3 scripts, and stamped it 4 times with 4 different stamps. And the last stamp he pressed down slowly, with both hands, the way a man closes a good deal. Article 40 entry declared and provisioned, he said. The garrison will be informed. And then, in the flat Onese way that I came to understand was their species' entire sense of humor operating at full power. I anticipate the paperwork with pleasure. So that was how a 54-year-old human cargo foreman ended up on the entry slate that a Kashek aide read to a mess hall in a slow leak voice. Not pride. Provisions. I'd have told anyone who asked, and eventually everyone did ask, and I told them, and not one of them believed me, because no species on Sessenring could fit the idea into their heads, that a human would walk into the most prestigious strength event in the garrison's calendar for the meal card and a boat engine. The morning after the mess hall, the mockery found its legs. Someone had recorded Vrelick inspecting my arm, and the clip ran on the station feeds with a caption in 6 scripts. The Kashek caption, I was told, translated to garrison to host comedy event. The Valeri one was longer and apparently funnier. By midshift, the clip had spread to the freight decks, and my own crew was playing it on the break room screen when I walked in. Boss, said Okafor, who ran the loading frames on 6, tell me this is a glitch feed. It's not a glitch. The 9 burdens. The one where the big shell set the record. That's the one. The one where the yoke at the end weighs more than my sled. I read the rules sheet, I said, which was already becoming my whole press strategy, and picked up the shift manifest, and we went to work. But here is the thing about that first wave of laughter, the thing I noticed standing in the garrison mess with a tray in my hands, and kept noticing all the way to the end. They weren't wrong to laugh. Exactly. By every measure their world kept, the entry was absurd. A Kashek under load is a marvel of engineering. A Valeri's stride eats a corridor. Even the Draza, who are built like whips, can sprint a burden segment in a time I couldn't match falling down a lift shaft. Every species in that mess hall was stronger than me, faster than me, bigger than me, and they all knew it, and they were all correct. They had simply never bothered to learn the one thing about humans that mattered for this particular event, because it had never once occurred to any of them that it could matter, and I felt no obligation to bring it up. It wasn't a secret. It was on file. It just wasn't the kind of fact that looks like anything, sitting in a medical database next to the numbers about shell-less arms. We don't stop. The equipment inspection came 3 days into the provision period, and it was the second best comedy the garrison had enjoyed all cycle, right after the entry itself. The rules required every entrant to declare their training equipment so the adjudicators could certify it contained no augments, no stimulants, no gravity cheats. Vrelick's declaration, I heard, ran to 9 pages. A calibrated resistance frame imported from the Kajak homeworld, a metabolic tuning suite, a hired conditioning master with a title I couldn't pronounce, and a neurostim rig that taught his muscle groups to fire in sequences his own nerves hadn't thought of. The other serious entrants filed similar documents. The Draza sprinter, Sava, declared a whole gymnasium annex. My declaration was 1 page, and Pemmel read it aloud to the inspection panel with what I can only describe as relish. Item 1. Cargo straps. Standard freight issue. Quantity 4. He turned the page over, confirmed there was nothing on the back, and turned it again. Item 2. 1 water drum 60 liters with harness. Item 3. He paused, and I swear the old bureaucrat was timing it. The stairs, said the senior adjudicator, a Valeri, whose neck made a slow interrogative curve like a crane considering a fish. Spin-spoke maintenance stairwell, deck 6 to deck 1, I said. 1,140 steps. I'd have brought them in for inspection, but they're load-bearing. The panel stared at me. Somewhere behind me, in the gallery where the garrison troops were allowed to observe, the slow leak noise started up again, and this time it had harmonies. The feeds ran the inspection that night with the caption, "Human declares stairs." It was, I'm told, the most shared clip on Sessenring for a week, beating out an actual hull breach on deck 11. Vrelick himself attended the inspection, banner scales and all, and when the panel certified my cargo straps, Pemmel stamped each strap individually, 4 stamps taking his time. The champion crossed to where I stood and looked down at me from his full height. "Straps," he said, "a drum of water. Stairs." "Certified stairs now," I said. "I have seen your training, little handler. My aide follows the feeds, you walk." He said the word the way you'd report a crime. You put the drum on your back and you walk the stairwell. Up and then down and then up. My hatchlings trained harder before their first molt. How'd that go for them? His eye stalks contracted, which I would learn meant he was thinking. They are champions of their creche. Good stock, I said, and meant it. And that confused him badly enough that he let me leave. I'll tell you what I told the panel, because it was the truth and nobody wrote it down. I wasn't training for the games, not the way they meant it. The deck was my training, and it had been for 30 years. A cargo foreman on a freight ring walks 11, 12 hours a shift. You lift, you carry, you brace, you climb, and you do it again after the meal break, and you do it the day after that, and the day after that, for decades, in boots. In a spin gradient, the engineers never quite smooth out. There is nothing impressive about any single hour of it. That's the point. There was nothing impressive about any single hour of my whole career, and the tonnage ledger had flagged me anyway, because the ledger could add. The stairs and the drum were just the deck, concentrated. I walked them on my relief days because relief days made me restless, and because deck 6 was short-handed and I felt bad enough taking the provision pay without keeping my legs honest. That was the other thing the feeds couldn't digest. I kept showing up for half shifts. The provision said I didn't have to work, and the pay came regardless, and every species on the ring understood the arrangement instantly and assumed I'd vanish into the gymnasium like the other entrants. Instead, the break room screen would show "Human declares stairs," while the human in question was visibly down on the floor of deck 6, guiding a loading frame because Okafor's crew was 2 handlers short and the manifests don't care about anyone's games. A Draza feed personality came down to interview me about it. She was professionally baffled. "You have been released from labor," she said. Microphone barb extended, "and you labor anyway. Is this a human spiritual discipline?" "We're short-handed," I said. "Is it a strategy? A psychological message to the champion?" "It's freight," I said. "It needs moving." She got 40 seconds of usable material out of me in 20 minutes, and the editors ran it with a title that translated to "Human entrant possibly does not understand games," which was fair. By their lights, I didn't. The medical certification was where the laughing first hiccuped, though almost nobody noticed at the time. Every entrant got examined by the garrison physician, a wet-skinned ISIL doctor named Huel who ran her clinic like a customs checkpoint. She'd certified Koshek and Valeri athletes for 40 cycles and had seen, by her own account, every way a body could lie to her. She put me through the scanners with the bored efficiency of someone stamping transit visas, and then she stopped being bored. It started with the cooling system. She ran the thermal stress profile, the one that simulates exertion load, and partway through she came around the scanner housing and looked at me directly. With both sets of eyelids open, which from an ISIL is a statement. "Your integument is discharging fluid," she said. "That's sweat. I am aware of the term." She flicked through the readout. "I have certified humans for transit. The files note the trait. I have never run one under sustained load." She watched the numbers a while longer. "Your body this is continuous? It does this indefinitely? Long as I keep drinking water. You shed heat by evaporating your own plasma volume and you replace it by drinking." She said it the way you'd read back a confession, getting it on the record, while moving. "That's about it. The Cossack," she said, mostly to herself, "vents heat through the molt seams. The seams open under sustained load. Past a threshold, the shell must lock to protect them, and then he stops, and he cools, and only then can he continue." The Valeri faint. "It is a clean mechanism. The blood simply declines to climb the neck past a certain core. Temperature. The Draza burned glycogen like a fuse, magnificent and brief." Her eyelids cycled. "Every species I certify has a wall handler called her. The body declares an end. I am looking for yours, and I am not finding it. It's there, I said. It just argues instead of declaring. She did not laugh. She was the second one who didn't after Pemmel. She certified me with a stamp and a note appended in her own script, and I found out much later what the note said because it became briefly famous in physiology circles on 3 worlds. It said, "No disqualifying condition found. Examiner recommends the garrison familiarize itself with the term fatigue debt as the entrance species appears, to have negotiated unusual repayment terms." But the feeds didn't read medical appendices, and the garrison didn't either, and the odds reflected it. Which brings me to Czech. Every station has someone like Czech, and on Sessenring she was an aging Ver who ran the wager book out of a kiosk between the mess and the gymnasium, feathers gone silver at the crest, eyes like audit software. The games were her harvest season. By the end of the first provision week she had, posted in glowing script above her kiosk, a line for every entrant in every event, and the line on me was the longest number anyone had ever seen on that board. The payout on Calder completes the 9 burdens was quoted at 410 to 1. As a joke, she also posted, Calder completes the first burden at 9 to 1, and that was considered generous to the point of charity. I went to her kiosk on a relief day, drum harness still on my shoulders, and the line of garrison troops placing wagers parted for me the way crowds part for the condemned. "Handler," Czech said, "come to see your number. Come to bet it." Czech's crest came up a centimeter. "On yourself. Completion line. All 9. I put my chit on the counter. The whole provision stipend. She looked at the chit. Behind me, a Cossack trooper made the slow leak noise, but quietly, almost respectfully, the way you'd whistle at a man stepping off a ledge. Czech did not touch the chit. "Handler," she said, "I have run this book for 30 cycles. I will take any wager a fool insists on. That is the business. But the 9 burdens has been completed twice in the garrison's recorded history, both times by Kajak, both times before the segment standards were raised. The champion himself has never finished it. You are asking me to hold 4 months of your pay on a thing that does not happen." You posted the line. I posted a joke. "Then it's cheap," I said and slid the chit across. She held my eye for a long moment, audit software running. Then she took the chit and printed the slip with that number on it, 410. And as she passed it over, she said the thing that I think of as the third hiccup, the third crack in the laughing, though I doubt she meant me to hear it. She said it to herself, in Ver, and one of the dockhands translated it for me later. What she said was, the clerk didn't laugh either, because Czech, it turned out, kept track of such things professionally. She had noticed what nobody on the feeds had bothered to notice, that sub-adjudicator Pemmel, who had processed every game's entry for 19 cycles and was famous for declining to wager even 1 stamp fee on anything, had walked to her kiosk the day my entry cleared and quietly put a month of his salary on the longest line on the board. When the feeds finally dug that up, weeks later, they asked Pemmel why. He gave them the flattest answer ever recorded on Sessenring, and my crew had it printed on a banner that hangs in the Deck 6 break room to this day. I read his file, Pemmel said. It contained 30 years of Tuesdays. The bet made things worse before it made anything better. By the next station morning, the feeds had it framed exactly the way you'd expect. Human wagers entire stipend on self with commentary. The commentary was the part that told you where you stood with each species. The Cossack pundits treated it as bravado, which they respected in the abstract and mocked in the particular. The Valeri treated it as a mathematics failure, and one of their education channels actually used my wager as a teaching example about probability with diagrams. The Draza treated it as performance art and gave it good reviews. Only the Anise channel said nothing, which I learned was how you knew the Anise were paying attention. The Garrison's evening debate program, there is one. It runs after the duty reports, and it is exactly as bad as you imagine, staged a formal pricing of my entry. They brought on a retired burden athlete, a sports actuary, and for reasons no one explained, a nutritionist. The athlete priced me at burden 1. The actuary, working from body mass and limb cross-section, priced me at burden 1 with a non-zero probability of failure during the lift itself. The nutritionist studied my ration card data, which the authorities should not have released, and which Pemmel later made them apologize for in triplicate, and announced with grave professional concern that I appeared to be eating like a creature twice my size with half my anxiety. That's the first accurate scouting report anyone's filed on me, I said, when Okafor played me the clip. Put it on the banner with the other one. Then the troopers started coming down to Deck 6, and that was a development nobody planned, least of all them. The first delegation arrived 4 days after the bet, 6 Cossack off-shift garrison troopers in civvies, which for a Cossack means decorative shell lacquer instead of armor, standing at the top of the loading floor like tourists at a quarry. Their spokesman, a young one with his rank scales barely grown in, announced that they had come to observe the human's natural habitat. He said it in the slow leak voice. His friends thought it was very funny, and to be fair, the delivery had improved across the station generally. Chef had set a high standard, and the garrison's youth were rising to it. Okafor walked up the stairs to meet them, wiping her hands on her coveralls, and looked the six of them up and down with the expression she reserved for cargo that had shifted in transit. "Observe, nothing," she said. "We're 2 handlers short and you've got 8 working limbs apiece. Grab a frame. I want to record what happened next with precision, because it became, in its quiet way, as important as anything that happened on the span." The young troopers looked at each other. Refusing would have been admitting the human work was beneath them, which was the whole joke. Except that standing there in front of 40 working humans, the joke needed somebody to laugh at it, and nobody on the floor had stopped moving. So they grabbed frames. Cossack strength on a loading floor is a wonder. The first hour, they shifted tonnage like a dream and made a show of yawning. The second hour, they were still magnificent. Partway through the third hour, the yawning stopped, and at the meal break, the young spokesman ate in silence. Eye stalks tracking the human crews who took 20 minutes, exactly 20, and went back to it. They lasted into the 6th hour, which Okafor told them honestly was a good first shift. The young one looked at her in a way I can only describe as betrayed. "First," he said. "How many hours is the shift?" 11, she said, 12 with the meal. "And you do this every day," said Okafor, who had been saying it for 30 years and had never once gotten to say it to someone whose whole skeleton reacted. "Same as the boss. Where do you think he trained?" "They came back, is the thing." That's the part the feeds never understood, and the garrison's officers understood entirely too well. The same 6 troopers came back 2 days later and worked another half shift, and the time after that they brought friends, and within a week Deck 6 had an informal rotation of off-duty Cossack garrison troops voluntarily hauling freight in the gradient, on their own time for no pay, with a focus that was no longer anything to do with comedy. The quartermaster's office sent a query asking whether the freight cooperative was poaching military labor. Okafor sent back a manifest showing throughput up 9% and a note reading, "Send more. They nap after 6 hours, it's sweet." And the garrison officers let it run because their instruments were telling them the same thing. Vreliks were starting too. Their troops came back from the human deck different. Not stronger. Cossack are born stronger than anything needs to be. They came back paced. The young spokesman, his name was Korep, and he matters to this story later, qualified for the next cycle's games on the strength of what the garrison was already calling, with no affection whatsoever for the implications, freight conditioning. Meanwhile, the merchandise appeared, because every station's economy abhors a vacuum. A printing stall on the commerce deck began selling shirts with a stylized water drum and the legend, in trade script, I read the rules sheet. Czech, who missed nothing, negotiated a percentage for me through Pemmel, who processed the agreement with 4 stamps and the observation that I was now, technically, the first human athletic brand in authority space. I signed where he pointed. The percentage went into the boat fund, line item, sales I did not need but had begun in moments of weakness to consider. I wrote home that week, the long letter I'd been putting off. There's a relay from Sessenring that bundles personal mail with the freight manifests, cheap if you don't mind your letter traveling as cargo, which I considered fitting. I told my sister about the stew and the stipend and the boat engine I'd be ordering, and at the end, because she'd hear it eventually from the relay news no matter what I did, I mentioned that I'd entered a local lifting event and that the neighbors were making a fuss about it. Her reply came back 2 weeks later, after everything, after the span, after the feeds of 6 worlds had run the footage. It said in its entirety, a fuss, Wesley. There are aliens on the news saying your name. Aunt Ruth wants to know if you met anyone nice. Also, what is a burden and why do they have 9 of them? Send money for the engine deposit, Pat. I framed it. It hangs in the shed, next to the chain link. Of the 2 documents, my crew maintains the letter is the more human, and after long reflection, I have come to agree. The qualifying carry was held 10 days before the games proper, in the gymnasium annex, and it existed to thin the roster. The rule was simple. 1 burden, 1 segment of the span at standard grade inside the time limit. Fail and you watch the games from the gallery. It was a formality for the serious entrants and a guillotine for the vanity ones, and the gallery filled up on qualifying day for the same reason crowds gather at ice under a warning sign. They ran us in flights of 6. I drew a flight with 2 Cossack garrison troopers, a Valeri lifter, a Draza I didn't know, and a Hudron Authority customs officer who had entered, as far as anyone could tell, on a dare. The yoke for the qualifier was the first burden yoke, a crossbar of black alloy with the mass block slung low on chain, 80 kilos and change, balanced badly on purpose. Tradition held that the founders of the games had designed the yokes to imitate field ordnance that had to be carried across broken country, back in whatever war the Cossack tell their children about. Whatever the truth, the thing was a pig to carry, and it was meant to be. The Cossack troopers shouldered theirs like luggage and finished their segment at a pace I'd call a jog. The Valyri made it look like ballet. The Draza blew through the segment so fast the timing system asked for a recount. The customs officer made it a third of the way, set the yoke down with great dignity, announced that honor was satisfied, and walked off to genuine applause. He'd lasted longer than anyone had bet he would, and Czech's kiosk took losses on him, which everyone agreed was the funniest possible outcome. Then the marshal called my name, and the gallery settled in for the main comedy. I want to describe what the span is like, because the feeds never got it across. It's a ring corridor, a third of a kilometer around, cut into the gymnasium deck where the station's spin gradient runs steep. The outer wall is transparent, so the gallery above can watch you the whole way around. The floor is textured plate, the same plate they use on the freight decks, which I noticed the moment I stepped on it, the way you notice an old coworker's voice in a strange port. And the grade, the effective weight, the lean of the world against you, shifts as you walk, because the segment runs you outward through the gradient. They engineer the carry to get heavier as you go. It is an honest piece of cruelty, and whoever designed it knew exactly what they were testing. I picked up the yoke the way you pick up the back end of an engine crate when the lift frame's down and the manifest due. Legs, hips, settle it. Let the chain stop swinging before you take the first step. The gallery found the settling hilarious. The mysterious entrance had all snatched and gone, racing the clock, and here was the human standing still with the yoke on his shoulders for 3 full breaths like a man listening for something. I was listening for something. I was listening for the balance point, same as I would on the deck, because a badly slung load punishes you at step 400, not at step 4. But it looks like nothing, and the slow leak noise came down from the gallery in stereo. Then I walked. Deck pace. The pace you set at hour 2 of a 12-hour shift, the one that has nothing to prove, because it has nowhere to be except everywhere, all day. The time limit for the segment was generous. It had been set for species that sprint and then stagger, and I came in under it with about a fifth to spare, dead last in my flight, breathing through my nose, and the scoreboard put my name up in the qualified column, and the gallery gave me the kind of cheer you give a pet that has done a trick. It was warm, I'll grant. There was no malice in that building. I was the best entertainment the garrison had had in cycles, and they were grateful, the way you're grateful to a dog that thinks it's people. But 2 things happened at the qualifier that mattered, and the crowd missed both. The first was that I didn't sit down. The protocol after a carry is that you set the yoke on the cradle, and then there's a recovery bench, and every entrant uses it because every entrant needs it. The Cossack to vent their seams, the Valyri to get the blood back up their necks, the Draza to refill whatever furnace they run on. I set the yoke down, rolled my shoulders, and went and stood by the rail to watch the next flight, because the bench was occupied and my shift started in an hour, and I didn't see the point of getting comfortable. I found out later that Vrelik's aide chef, the one with the slow leak impression, had been assigned to scout the qualifiers. His report to the champion that night was 4 lines long. 3 of them were about the Draza's split times. The 4th line, which Chef swore he included only for completeness, said, "The human finished the segment, declined recovery, and worked a half shift after. Recommend no action." Noting it anyway. Vrelik, I'm told, read the report and said the line that the whole station would be repeating by the end of the games, though at the time he meant it as a joke, and his trainers laughed in the manner that hired trainers laugh. He said, "Walked his segment, worked his shift." What is he recovering from? Nothing he does costs anything. It would be hard to write a more accurate sentence about the human species, and he'd meant it as an insult, and it would take him 8 burdens to hear what he'd said. The second thing that mattered was the straps. 2 days after the qualifier, an objection landed on Pemmel's desk. Vrelik's conditioning master had reviewed my equipment certification and filed a formal protest. The cargo straps were unregulated load distribution devices, and their use in training constituted preparation with non-standard equipment, and therefore my qualification should be voided. It was a nonsense objection. Every species trained with their own gear, but it was a nonsense. Objection drafted by a professional, and it had 17 citations, and it meant somebody on the champion's payroll had decided I was worth 17 citations of effort, which interested me more than it worried me. The hearing took place in Pemmel's fee office because the regulation chamber was being repainted. Picture it, the conditioning master, an off-world Cossack in formal shell lacquer, reading 17 citations aloud, me on a stool with a strap in my lap. and sub-adjudicator Pemmel behind his counter, stamps hanging, gray and motionless, absorbing all of it like a filing cabinet absorbing the afternoon. When the citations ran out, Pemmel picked up my strap and examined it for some time. "This is a freight strap," he said. "It is a load distribution device," said the conditioning master. "It is a freight strap. The authority issues them by the crate. There are, by inventory, 211,000 of them on this station." He set it down. "If the strap confers an advantage in the 9 burdens, the advantage has been available to every entrant in the game's history for the cost of walking to a supply locker. I find the equipment standard. Objection dismissed. Fee assessed to the filer. Form to follow." Then he paused, and the pause had stamps in it. A note for the record. "The entrant trained for 30 years on equipment identical in every respect to the equipment of his event, in the gravity of his event, on the floor plating of his event." The panel certified the stairs. If the objection's theory is correct, the filer's client may wish to reflect on what precisely has been certified. The conditioning master opened his mouth parts, thought better of it, paid his fee, and left. I stayed on the stool a moment. "You did that on purpose," I said. "The note." "I do everything on purpose," Pemmel said. "It is the whole job." He pulled a fresh form from under the counter and began inking it without looking up. "They confiscated nothing today," Handler called her, "but they have begun to spend money on you. Money follows belief. Be aware that the laughing and the believing can run side by side for a long time. They are not opposites. And the form?" "This form," said Pemmel, stamping it once with finality, "is my wager receipt, which I am framing. The sensor business happened the same week, and that one never made the feeds at all. I had it from Huel. The gymnasium's instrumentation included grip endurance plates, a standard diagnostic, and one of Relic's trainers, covering all approaches by then, had requested my qualifier telemetry to model when my hands would fail on the chains. The plates had recorded my grip pressure across the full segment, and the trainer ran the decay curve, and the curve came back wrong. Not impressive. Wrong. Cossack grip starts immense and steps down in clean tears as the shell muscle banks deplete. Mine started at a number the trainer found frankly insulting, and then failed to drop. The decay curve was so flat that the diagnostic software flagged its own sensor as faulty and scheduled a recalibration. And a technician spent a full shift testing the plate, and the plate was fine. The trainer filed the anomaly under equipment error anyway, because the alternative was filing it under something else. Huel told me all this in her clinic doorway, arms folded, both sets of eyelids open. "They keep finding it," she said, "and they keep filing it under error. Your species is sitting in their instruments in plain sight." "It's not much of a sight," I said. "That's the trouble. Nothing about us looks like anything until hour 6. And what happens at hour 6? Handler? Nothing. That's the other trouble. Nothing happens at hour 6. Nothing happens at hour 10 either. It upsets people." Huel's eyelids cycled slowly. 8 days to the games," she said. "I have amended the medical staffing plan. They asked me to position stretcher teams for you at segment 3. She turned back into her clinic. "I have positioned them at segment 9. For the others." 2 nights later, the mess hall got its rematch, and the Valeri with the long neck got his. I'd kept eating at the garrison mess. The provision said I could, and the marrow stew said I should. And by then my arrival was a fixture. A ripple of attention, a few slow leak noises from the cheap tables, and a seat that had somehow become mine, end of the 3rd table, near the cooks. The Valeri trooper, whose name was Andron of the Coastal Androns or something equally geographic, had been the author of the weighing ceremony line, the biggest laugh of that first night, and he had spent the days since watching his joke age badly as I qualified, survived the equipment hearing, and walked the champion's exhibition into the ground. A joke aging badly sits heavy on a Valeri. They are tall people in every sense, and they do not enjoy looking up. He unfolded himself from his bench as I sat down, and the room went quiet on cue. Even Money said apology. Even Funny said doubling down. The mess hall held its breath, hoping for either because both were entertainment. "Human Calder," he said, formal, neck at full interrogative extension. "I wagered against you at the weighing ceremony. I heard. Got the biggest laugh of the night." "It did," he agreed with the honesty of a man at a funeral for his own material. "I have come to revise my position." He produced his wager slip and held it up for the room. "I have moved my stake. I now hold you to fail at the 4th burden. This represents," and his neck made the slow curve, playing to the gallery, "a 1,000% improvement in my respect." The room laughed, and it was a good line, and I let it land because timing is most of what I own. "Andron," I said when it was quiet enough, "what do Valeri do with wager winnings?" "Traditionally, a feast for one's table." "Then here's my counter. If I set down at 4, I'll fund your feast," it's myself. "I went back to my stew for 1 beat 2, and if I walk past 4, you carry my water can up the spin spoke. 1 trip. During the feast, you'll be buying the table instead." You could feel the mess hall do the math, not the odds, the picture. 3 meters of coastal Valeri aristocrat hauling a dockworker's 60-liter drum up 1,140 steps in front of God and the garrison. Andron's neck came down a few degrees as the same picture arrived behind his eyes. But a Valeri in front of a room has no reverse gear, and to his lasting credit, he didn't look for one. "Done," he said, and we touched wrists in the Valeri style, and the mess hall roared, and Czech, who had materialized at the serving rail the way she materialized anywhere money changed shape, posted the side bet on her board before I'd finished the bowl. "I'll spoil it now since the span already spoiled it." He carried the drum. He carried it the week after the games in dress uniform by his own insistence, with half the station lining the stairwell, and at the top he set it down, straightened to his full ceremonial height, and announced to the assembled feeds, "The water is heavier than it looks. So is the human." Then he funded the largest feast the garrison mess had thrown in 9 cycles and seated me at the head of his table, where I learned that Valeri coastal cooking is mostly an excuse for arguing about boats, and that I had more in common with the coastal Androns than with most species in the room. We correspond. He is building a hull of his own now, to a Valeri pattern, all length and no beam, and it will capsize the first time the wind looks at it, and I have told him so, and he builds on. I find I can't fault a man for that. But that was after. Before, in the last quiet days, there was one more visit worth setting down, because it was the only one that came close to rattling me. The authority sent an official, not garrison, authority, the civil power, a hoodron in administrative gray whose title translated to something like Undersecretary for the Avoidance of Incidents, and she came to deck 6 unannounced and asked for 10 minutes. We took it at the rail above the floor, freight moving below, and she watched the frame swing for a while before she said anything. Handler called her. "Are you aware of the wagering volume on the closing event?" I try not to follow it. The volume is now larger than the station's quarterly fuel budget. Bets are arriving by relay from systems that could not place Sessenring on a chart before this cycle. She kept her eyes on the loading floor. When the laughing started, this was a garrison amusement. It is now, functionally, a diplomatic event. Species who have never priced humans at all are watching the feeds to learn how. Whatever happens on the span will travel. "That's a lot of weight on one set of shoulders," I said. "Yes," she said. I came to assess how the shoulders were taking it. The frame swung. Below us, Okafor's voice carried up, chewing out a Cossack volunteer for stacking against the gradient, and the Cossack apologized and restacked, and the work went on, the way the work always goes on. "Undersecretary," I said, "you see that manifest queue? 1,100 crates by end of shift, and the shift before that there was another queue, and tomorrow there'll be another. Nobody watches. Nothing rides on any crate except everything. Same as always. That's the event I've been entered in my whole life." I nodded down at the floor. "The span's just shorter, and somebody finally put seats around it." She looked at me for a long moment, the way Pemmel had at the fee counter, the way Huel had over the scanner, that pause I'd learned to recognize, the sound of a file being moved from one cabinet to another. "The authority," she said at last, "will make no statement, take no position, and prepare 2 versions of the post-event communique." A pause. "Off the record. Handler. The second version has been drafted by an Anise sub-adjudicator who demanded the assignment, and it is the finest piece of bureaucratic writing I have seen in 40 years of service. I have begun to suspect what he knows." She straightened her gray tunic and turned to go, then stopped. "He ends it with a citation from your own file, your tonnage ledger, of all things. Cited like scripture." 30 years of Tuesdays," I said. "So you do know what you are," said the Undersecretary for the Avoidance of Incidents, and left, and did not look as though she expected to avoid one. The demonstration was Vrelik's idea, and to be fair to him, it was a good one. It just wasn't good in the direction he intended. 6 days out from the games, the Champions people announced an open training exhibition in the main gymnasium. Garrison champion Vrelik would walk a full segment at 4th Burden Mass in public as a gift to the garrison and an inspiration to the youth. And this was the part his aide announced with the slow leak voice already loaded. All qualified entrants were courteously invited to walk. Alongside, that the garrison might see its athletes in proportion. In proportion, everyone understood. The Draza declined, citing training schedule. The Valeri declined, citing dignity. The other Cossack declined, citing the 11th cycle of not being stupid. The invitation had been built with exactly one acceptance in mind, and the gallery knew it, and on the appointed shift, the gymnasium was packed to the rails with every off-duty soul on Sessenring, plus a good number of on-duty ones whose supervisors had discovered urgent inspections to perform near the railings. I accepted, obviously. I'd have been a fool not to. He was offering me a free segment at event grade with the whole station watching, and my shift didn't start till the back half of the day. They racked 2 yokes at 4th Burden Mass, 210 kilos for him, his exhibition standard, and the entrance scaled equivalent for me, which the handicapping tables put at 130. The mass scaling was ancient and uncontroversial. The games had always scaled the burden to the body, because the event wasn't testing what you could lift. It was testing what you could keep lifting. Nobody in the game's history had ever thought hard about that distinction. It was about to start costing them money. Vrelix shouldered his yoke like a coat. I did my 3 breaths and the gallery did its slow leak, all warm, all familiar by now. I was the station's pet absurdity, and there was real affection in it. Then we walked. He set a champion's exhibition pace, smooth as rail freight, plates rolling, chains quiet. It was a beautiful thing to watch up close, and I had the best seat on the station. I settled in 2 steps behind his flank at my deck pace, which happened, give or take, to match. For the first lap, the gallery cheered him and chuckled at me. For the second lap, the gallery cheered him and watched me. I just walked. Sweat started up the way it does. Hour 2 sweat, nothing dramatic. A Cossack walking a burden is dry as ceramic. A human walking a burden glistens, and the front rows started elbowing each other and pointing, because to them I looked like a machine with a coolant leak, laboring, surely 2 laps from collapse. Surely 1 lap from collapse. Surely collapsing now. The exhibition had been scheduled by his own people for 1 segment, 1/3 of a kilometer at burden grade, the showpiece distance. We finished it together, him serene, me damp. The gallery roared. He racked his yoke and turned to salute the crowd, and his eye stalks found me still under mine. "You may set it down, little handler," he said, gracious in front of the rails. "The exhibition is concluded." "I figured I'd get my walk in while I'm here," I said. "I'll do a few more." There is a particular quality of quiet that I'd come to recognize on Sessenring, and it landed on that gymnasium then. Not silence, murmurs. Feathers shifting, someone's translation bead buzzing, but the laugh going out of a room the way tide goes out, gradually, and then you notice the boats are sitting on mud. He could have left. I want that on the record too, because everything that came later started in this moment. He could have saluted and walked off to his trainers and let the human plod his laps in an emptying hall, and the feeds would have run champion gracious, human odd, and nothing would have changed. Instead, garrison champion Vrelix, 11 cycles unbeaten, looked at a damp middle-aged cargo foreman declining to stop, and something in that armored head, pride or instinct, or the first cold draft of arithmetic, would not let it stand. He picked his yoke back up. We walked another segment together, then another. His pace stayed beautiful. My pace stayed mine. The gallery, which had come for a comedy, stopped being a gallery and became a crowd, which is a different animal, quieter, hungrier. Somewhere in the 4th extra segment, Czech appeared at the rail with her slate, and I watched her watching us, crest very still, and the number above her kiosk dropped from 410 that evening, though I didn't learn it till later. In the 6th extra segment, the seams of his shell open. You could hear it if you knew to listen. A faint hiss of vented heat, regular as bilge pumps, the Cossack body doing what Huel had described. Shedding load the only way it could. It is not a weakness. It's engineering, but it has a budget, and the budget was being spent 2 steps ahead of me at exhibition pace. And the trainers at the rail had instruments, and the instruments were telling them what the crowd couldn't see. His conditioning master called time at the start of the 8th extra segment, called it loudly, citing the training schedule, citing peak management protocols, citing there was a kind of genius to it, concern for the human entrance well-being. Vrelix racked his yoke. His plates had a dull bloom across them, heat sheen, and his stride going to the rack had lost a centimeter, and only the instruments and I knew it, and the instruments weren't talking, and neither was I. I racked mine. The marshal asked, with elaborate courtesy, whether I required medical attention. "I could eat," I said. The crowd laughed, relieved to have something to laugh at, the old comfortable joke restored. But it was a different laugh leaving the gym than the one that had come in, and everyone in that building knew it, even the ones who couldn't have said what changed. Huel's clinic note from that evening, she showed me, after everything, logged Vrelix recovery telemetry, transmitted automatically by the gym, seam vent duration long, core normalization longer, and appended, in her own script in the dry Issel hand that I'd come to think of as the only honest commentary on the whole affair. The exhibition demonstrated proportion, as advertised. The 5 days that followed were the strangest of my life up to then, which is saying something for a man who once spent a contract year hauling fermented dairy futures for a Ver consortium. The mockery didn't stop. Understand that. It got louder. If anything, the feeds had their best material yet, and I could eat, joined human declare stairs in the rotation, and a Cossack comedy troupe on the lower decks added a whole act where one of them walked in circles wearing a wet shirt. The wager kiosk did volume check, described as indecent. The slow leak noise followed me down corridors. But it ran shallower, and underneath it, things were moving. The young Anise from the fee office, a junior stamp carrier named Phipps, started appearing in the spin-spoke stairwell on my training walks, 2 flights behind, with a small water can on his back. He never spoke. Anise don't until the paperwork's done. The second day there were 2 of them. By the 4th day there were 6 entities in that stairwell of 4 different species, including a Valeri customs cadet who had to take the steps in a crouch, all of them walking up and down behind a human with a drum, and not one of them could have told you precisely why. I didn't ask. You don't interrupt freight that's moving. Chef, the aide, came to deck 6. I found him at the rail above the loading floor on my half shift, watching the crews work, and he watched for a long time before he came down and stood next to me, and his voice had no impression in it at all. 11 hours, he said. A standard shift on this deck is 11 hours, 12 with the meal break, and you have done this for 30 years. He looked at the loading floor, the frame swinging, Okafor's crew braced and hauling in the gradient, every one of them sweating, every one of them ignoring it. All of you, the whole deck does this, every day. This is, he searched for the word and gave up, and used the one he had, ordinary. That's the one, I said. He went away without another word, and I will always wonder exactly what he put in that night's report, because the next morning the Champions Camp canceled all public appearances, and the gymnasium annex went private, and a garrison quartermaster I knew slightly told me over a crate manifest that Vrelic's people had requisitioned quietly against the closing event for the first time in 11 cycles. Endurance telemetry packages. The champion had started training to last. It was the highest compliment anyone paid me on Sessenring, and he'd have sooner molted in public than say it out loud, and I respected that completely. We were past the comedy by then, him and me. Whatever the feeds were still running. 2 professionals had looked at the same piece of freight and reached the same estimate. The rest of the station would need event day to catch up. The night before the games, Okafor and the Deck 6 crew stood me a dinner in the break room. Printed paste, garnished with 1-1 marrow sutu smuggled down from the garrison mess by a cook who I will not name because the regulation he broke carries a fine. They'd all bet on me at checks, every one of them, at numbers from 410 down to the 220 it had fallen to by closing. Not because they were sure, because, as Okafor put it, raising a mug of recycler coffee in the general direction of the spin-spoke stairwell, "Boss, we've watched you walk for years. Those poor shells have only watched you walk for 20 days. The weighing ceremony took place on the morning of the closing event in the gymnasium rotunda, and it was the last piece of pure theater the games had to offer, and the last chance anyone got to laugh at me from a position of comfort, and to the garrison's credit, a few of them took it. Tradition dictated that each entrant be weighed on the founder's balance, an actual mechanical balance, older than the station, all black iron and counterweights, hauled out once a cycle and polished like a relic, and that their event scaling be proclaimed by the marshal in the old form, mass and class, and declared distance, while the entrance stood on the plate for the whole rotunda to see. The serious entrance made it look like coronation. Vrelic on the founder's balance was a sight. The counterweights went out to the last notch, the iron arms settled like a judgment, and the marshal's proclamation of his mass got the kind of cheer that mass alone can pull from a crowd raised to price bodies by the ton. Sava's weigh-in got laughter and delight, so little, so fast, and she bowed like the performer she was. Then it was me, and the counterweights came nearly all the way back in, and the rotunda enjoyed that thoroughly. The marshal, reading the old form, proclaimed my mass, my class. They'd had to consult the archive. The class designation hadn't been used since the standards were drawn, and my declared distance, all 9. Confirmed declaration, said the marshal, which was ritual. Everyone confirmed. Confirmed, I said. Same as the paperwork. It got a laugh, but I want to describe the laugh precisely because I'd become a connoisseur by then. It was short. It had a lean in it. Half that rotunda had money on me by event morning. Check's final book, published after settlement as required, showed the line on Calder completes had been bet down from 410 to 1 all the way to 19 to 1, the steepest collapse in the book's history, and a crowd that has bet on you laughs differently than a crowd that has bet against you. Same noise, different weather. Vrelic's camp had done their own arithmetic, and event morning was when it surfaced. His conditioning master, the same off-world professional who'd filed 17 citations against my straps, approached me at the staging floor while the vanity entrants were still being weighed, and stood beside me in formal shell lacquer, watching the balance work, and spoke without turning. I reviewed the exhibition telemetry for 20 days, he said. I have trained burden champions on 4 stations. I will say this once, because my client forbids me to say it at all. The lacquered eye stalk stayed forward. We modeled you against every endurance profile in the archive. Nothing fit. So I requisitioned profiles outside athletics, migration data. Disaster logistics. Search and rescue logs. A pause. Handler, the profile that fit you was not an athlete's. It was infrastructure. We have been preparing my client to race a road. Roads don't finish, I said. No, said the conditioning master. That was the content of my report. He turned then and made a small, precise bow, the kind professionals trade across a contract table. He trained for the 8th burden anyway. He knows he cannot match you, and he has chosen to spend himself entirely rather than adjust the goal. I want one human on this station to know that before it happens and understand what it is. I know what it is, I said. It's the same thing I'm doing. Tell him I said so. He will ask in what spirit you said it. Tell him, one professional pricing another. Correctly, this time. The bow he gave me then was lower, and he lacquered out of my morning, and I have thought about that conversation more than almost anything else from those days, because it was the moment the game stopped having a joke in them anywhere. Everyone with instruments knew by event morning. The crowd half knew. What remained was only the doing of it, which is the part my species has always considered the actual event, and the part every other species kept mistaking for the formality at the end. The marshal called the entrance procession at mid-morning. We walked the staging floor in class order, me first, alone, the archived class of 1, through the rotunda and out along the gallery ring. The whole slow ceremonial lap, while the stands filled and the festival cooking smoked the air and 40 species made the 40 noises they make when something is about to become a story. Okafor and the Deck 6 crew had the rail spot above the first cradle. They'd traded shift swaps for it for a month. They didn't cheer when I passed. They did the thing freight crews do at shift change, the thing nobody planned. 40 humans in coveralls came to a loose, easy attention and touched their knuckles to the rail. Once, like a manifest being signed, the feeds caught it and ran it for days with anthropological commentary, every word of it wrong. It wasn't a salute. It was simpler than that. It meant, load's yours now, boss. We checked the straps ourselves. Phipps was there too, in the Anise section, with what I would later learn was Pemmel's entire fee office on an unprecedented, simultaneous administrative leave that Pemmel had personally approved, stamped, and filed under succession planning, and Huel in the commentary booth with her self-issued credential. And Andrin with his table of coastal Valyri, his 4th burden wager slip pinned to his dress sash like a decoration, where everyone could see what he'd be paying off by sundown, and check at her kiosk under the big board, line suspended, book closed, watching her own life's strangest entry walk past at deck pace. And at the end of the procession, by tradition the champion, walking alone, banner scales fresh oiled, to the loudest sustained sound the rotunda owned. He drew level with me at the staging floor as the procession dissolved, that vast slate shadow falling over me one more time, the way it had in the mess hall a month and a lifetime of pricing ago. The rotunda hushed itself to hear the mockery. Old habits. Little handler, Vrelick said, and the slowly crowd-pleaser voice was nowhere in it. My aide informs me you worked a half shift last night. Deck was short-handed the night before the 9 burdens. Freight needed moving, I said. It's a Tuesday. His eye stalks contracted, the thinking look, and then he did the thing the feeds replayed past counting. Garrison champion Vrelick, 11 cycles unbeaten, threw back his armored head and laughed, plates ringing. A Cossack laugh with the whole shell behind it, the first wholly honest laugh anyone had aimed at me since the entry list was read. It wasn't mockery coming back. It was a professional getting the joke at last, the joke under the joke, the one with the punchline coming for everyone, and choosing, with the whole station watching, to be in on it. Then let us move freight, he said. Event day on Sessenring smelled like polish and ozone and 40 kinds of festival cooking, and the span gallery was full 3 hours before the first yoke came off the rack. The 9 burdens closed the games by tradition, the last event of the last day, and by the time the marshal called the entrance to the floor, every other medal had been hung, every other story written, and the whole ring, garrison, freight decks, customs, the lot, had folded itself around that transparent corridor like a hand around a coin. The rules of the closing event are worth setting down plainly because everything that follows hangs on them. 9 burdens. Each burden is 1.5 segments of the span, half a kilometer, near enough, at a mass and grade that step up with each burden scaled to the entrance body class. Between burdens, a rest interval at the cradle stations, fixed length, no extensions. You walk each burden inside its time standard. You finish all 9, or you set the yoke down wherever your body files its objection, and where you set it down is your score. 26 entrants had qualified. The all-time record was Vrelick's, 7 burdens and 1/3 of the 8th. No entrant in the modern standards had ever picked up the 9th yoke. The 9th cradle had been polished for cycles by a maintenance crew that privately considered it ornamental. They staggered our starts to keep the span clear, slowest class first, which meant me. Which meant that for the opening quarter hour, the gallery got exactly the show it had paid for. The The human comedy, alone on the long curve, damp and deliberate, while the serious athletes stretched and oiled and posed down on the staging floor. I heard the slow leak noise come down from 100 throats when I did my 3 breaths under the first yoke. I heard the affectionate laugh when I set off at deck pace, last entrant, first started, the tortoise act opening for the main bill. First burden. Nothing. 105 kilos at my scaling. Grade gentle, half a kilometer of warm-up. I came in well under standard, took my interval at the cradle, drank water, ate a strip of ration fish, didn't sit. The bench protocol again, entrants behind me were already using theirs hard. The Draza Sava blew past me on the span mid-burden, lapping into her own second burden already, moving like a thrown knife, and the crowd sang her around the curve. Magnificent and brief, Huell had said. I gave her 3 more burdens. Second burden, the wager line. This was the burden Vrelick had named in the mess hall, the one he'd called a generous estimate, and half the gallery had money on it, and when I crossed its end inside standard, the groan that went around the span was so unified, so heartfelt, that the marshal formally checked whether the gallery itself required medical attention. That got passed around the feeds inside the hour. The other thing that happened on the second burden got no commentary at all. The customs dare contingent, the vanity entrants, a dozen of them, began setting their yokes down. The span has a sound for it, a chain slack clatter, and then the cradle chime, polite as a fee office bell, and that chime started tolling steady as the grades stepped up, and every chime subtracted 1 body from between me and the front. Third burden, the stretcher teams. They'd been positioned for me. I knew where. Huell had told me, and I passed Segment 3's medical bay at my same pace and gave the stretcher crew a nod, and one of them, an ISIL orderly, solemnly nodded back, and then, when his supervisor wasn't looking, made a small flat gesture with one webbed hand that I chose to read as a wave. The first Valeri went down on this burden, neck faint, blood declining the climb exactly as designed, caught by his own spotters before he hit the plate. Clean mechanism. The chime rang. The crowd's laugh when it came back to me on my slow lap had developed a thoughtful undertone. Fourth burden, the sweat commentary. 155 kilos at my scaling now, grade leaning into everyone, and the gallery feeds ran close-ups between the leaders' split times, and someone in the commentary booth said it, live, station-wide. The human entrant appears to be in fluid distress, and Huell, who had planted herself in that booth on a medical liaison credential she had absolutely issued to herself, replied in the flattest broadcast voice in ISIL history, "He is cooling. That is the system working. You are watching a body pay for heat and water and buy more water at the next cradle. He can do this, as far as the literature knows, indefinitely." There was a pause, station-wide. Then the other commentator asked what every species on the ring asked next, the question of the whole day. "What do you mean, indefinitely?" And Huell said, "I mean, we have never once been funded long enough to find the end of it." I felt the gallery change around the span like weather. You can feel a few thousand creatures refile you, all at once, from one cabinet to another. The slow leak noise died out somewhere on the fourth burden, and it never came back, not once, not from anyone, for the rest of the day. Fifth burden, Sava. I'd given her 3 more burdens and she'd taken 4, better than my estimate, a genuinely great performance. Her 5th burden splits were garrison records that stand today. The fuse burned all the way down mid-segment, between cradles, and a Draza hitting glycogen empty doesn't faint, she just stops, like a vid on pause, yoke still up, 1 foot forward. Her spotters got the mass off her shoulders and she folded down onto the plate and sat there, heaving. And as I came past at the pace I'd held since the first chain went taut, she looked up, and the look on that whip-thin face wasn't mockery and wasn't even surprise. It was arithmetic. She was running my splits against the standards and getting an answer her species files under myth. "Handler," she rasped as I passed. "What burden are you on?" "Same one as you," I said, 5. "And how do you feel?" It was an honest question, professionally meant, and it deserved an honest answer. And the honest answer was the punchline my whole species had been holding since the founders of those games designed a contest about continuing and then never invited us. "Hour 2, I said, and kept walking. 6th burden, the leader's wall. The modern standards put a cliff between 6 and 7. Everyone in the gallery knew it, and this was where the games traditionally ended for everyone but Kashek. The remaining Valeri set down with honors at 6 exactly. The chime for an honorable 6 gets a drum salute, and he'd earned it. The 2 garrison Kashek troopers from my qualifying flight made it into the 7th, and you could hear their seams from the gallery rail, vent hiss like a switchyard, and they sat down within a segment of each other, and the drums went for them too. By the back half of the 6th burden, the span, which had started the day carrying 26 entrants, was down to a field you could count on one human hand. Vrelick, started last as champion, was walking through everything ahead of him on pace for his own record. Plates dry, stride immaculate. the best closing event athlete in the garrison's history, doing the thing he had been hatched and built and trained for. The crowd that had laughed itself hoarse at me in the mess hall was getting, at the front of the field and the back of it at once, the two best performances of the 9 burdens ever recorded, and to their credit, I mean this, the credit is real. They understood it before either of us finished. Somewhere on the 6th burden, the gallery of Sessenring stopped watching a comedy and a coronation and realized it was watching a question, the same question, asked of 2 completely different machines. Where exactly do you end? His machine answered first. The 7th burden is where the 9 stop being a contest and become a negotiation with your own chassis, and I'll describe mine honestly, because the feeds afterward made it sound effortless, and that's a disservice to everyone, my species included. It was not effortless. 200 kilos at my scaling. The grade out on the 7th arc leans on you like a drunk uncle. My feet had been wet in my boots since the 4th burden, my shoulders were 2 bars of old iron, and the yoke chains had worn a groove into my collarbones that I'd be wearing under my shirt for a month. But here is the distinction. The one whole species built empires without grasping. Everything I've just listed is pain, and pain is information, and information is not a wall. The Cossack shell locks, the Valeri faints, the Draza pauses. Those are walls. The body unilaterally files its motion and the matter is closed. What my body filed on the 7th burden was a complaint, strongly worded, properly formatted. And my body, after 30 years on the decks, knew perfectly well what I do with complaints. I note them, I thank the filer, and the freight keeps moving. I ate on the move, ration paste from a sleeve, a trick every dockhand knows and no games athlete had ever been seen doing, and the commentary booth treated it like sorcery. I drank at the cradle. I did not sit. The interval clock ran out, and the 8th yoke came up off the rack, 220. And the span by then held exactly 2 entrants, and the gallery had gone into a sound I'd never heard from any crowd anywhere, a low, continuous murmur, thousands of translation beads working at once, every species on Sessenring narrating the same arithmetic to itself in its own tongue. Vrelick came up on me midway through my 8th, on pace to pass his own record with daylight to spare. I heard him long before I saw him. Not his stride was still parade quality. His seams. The vent hiss had gone ragged, a switchyard with a pump running behind, and when his shadow fell across me on the long outward arc, I could feel the heat coming off his shell from 2 meters. Like walking past an oven with the door cracked, he drew level. The champion of 11 cycles and the human comedy, side by side on the 8th burden of the 9, with every eye and lens on the ring pressed against that transparent wall, and the whole gallery waiting for whatever a champion says at the moment. History is watching. What he said low, between vents, in the tone of one professional to another at the rail of a loading floor, was how, not a taunt, a real question, maybe the first one he'd asked in cycles. He had spent 20 days buying telemetry and hiring specialists trying to answer it, and the specialists had given him decay curves and error flags, and here was the source document dripping, 2 steps to his left on pace. You vent through the seams, I said. Talking cost me, but he'd paid for the answer with the asking. All at once when the load says so. I vent the whole way through, little and constant. I tap my soaked shirt collar. You're built for the lift, champion. I'm built for the shift. He walked beside me in silence for a dozen strides, processing that with whatever Akashek uses for a soul. Then he said, and I put this on the record, because the feeds never got it, and his species' honor deserves it told straight. In the mess hall, I priced you at the 2nd burden. Vent, vent. It was the finest joke of my career. I have not laughed since the exhibition vent. I find I do not miss it. And he lengthened his stride because he was still the champion, and he went away up the arc to break his own record, which he did. 7 burdens and a third had stood for cycles, and garrison champion Vrelick retired it forever by finishing the 8th burden entire. The first in the modern standards to do it on shell lock and willpower and 11 cycles of knowing how. He made the 8th cradle with his seams roaring and his plates blooming dull. And he set the yoke in, set it, controlled, even then. And the shell did what Huel always said it must. It locked, all his armor seizing at once into a statue of a champion standing upright at. The cradle and the drum salute for him went so long the marshal finally had to wave it off so the event could continue. Because the event hadn't ended. The polished, ornamental, never-once lifted 9th yoke was still on its rack. And the interval clock was running on the only entrant left. I want to tell you it felt like history. It felt like hour 11 of a 12-hour shift, which is the most truthful sentence in this whole account, and the one thing I had that no purse could buy and no rig could train. I had felt exactly this before, 10,000 times, and I knew for a documented fact that it was survivable, because every one of those times had been a Tuesday, and every Tuesday had been followed by a Wednesday. They had to consult the regulations to fuel the ninth cradle's interval station. I stood at the eighth, drinking, not sitting, 20 paces from the locked statue of the champion, and his eye stalks were the only part of him with play left in them, and they were aimed at me. The medics moved around him with cooling wraps. Huel's stretcher teams, positioned at 9, exactly where she'd promised, working on exactly who she'd predicted. The marshal asked the formal question, because the rules required it. Did the entrant declare the ninth burden or set down with honors at 8? 8 entire, already a co-record, already the story of the cycle. The gallery had gone as quiet as a pressurized structure full of thousands of bodies can go. And in that quiet, I'll confess the one theatrical thing I did in the whole games, my single concession to the occasion, and I did it mostly for the Deck 6 crew watching on the break room screen with their wager slips in their fists. I rolled my shoulders, looked up at the rail, and asked, "What's the time standard on 9? I've got a half shift in the morning." You could hear the laugh start somewhere up in the cheap rail spots and go around the entire span like current closing a circuit. But it was a new laugh, the third kind I'd heard on Sessenring, not the mess hall laugh and not the Petrick laugh. It was the laugh a crowd laughs at the exact moment its world gets one species bigger. Pemmel told me afterward that the Onese have a single word for that laugh, and it appears almost exclusively in their constitutional documents. The ninth yoke massed 245 kilos at my scaling. The chains had never been worn smooth. They bit fresh. I did my 3 breaths. Nobody made the slow leak noise. The marshal's flag dropped, and I took the dirtiest, heaviest, most ceremonial half-kilometer in garrison history at the exact pace I had set out at on the first burden 7.5 hours earlier. Deck pace. Hour 2 pace. The pace that has nowhere to be except everywhere all day. I won't pretend the last arc was anything but ugly. The grade out there is a fist. I stopped being a man walking and became a committee. Legs voting, lungs vetoing. 30 years of Tuesdays chairing the meeting. Twice the yoke told me, with great sincerity, that here was a reasonable place to die, and twice the committee noted the objection and the freight kept moving. The gallery had stopped murmuring. Thousands of bodies, 4 dozen species, and the only sounds on Sessenring were my boots on freight plating, the same plating, the identical plating, I want this carved somewhere, that the authority uses on Deck 6, and somewhere behind me, faint, rhythmic, a locked champion venting at the 8th cradle in time with my steps. Chef swore to me afterward, and I believe him, that the vents were deliberate, that Vrelik, frozen, spent, beaten, was keeping my cadence for me the only way his body had left. The Cossack have a word for that too. It does not translate as applause, it translates, near as Pemmel could render it into trade, as the drum a soldier makes of himself for the next soldier through the wall. The ninth cradle took the yoke out of my hands at the end of the half-kilometer with the chime they'd polished for cycles and never rung, and the structure of Sessenring is rated for meteor strikes and torch failures, and I am here to report it, had never been tested against the noise that several thousand creatures of 40 species make upon discovering, all at once, in person, what a human being is for. They tried to put me on a stretcher and I declined, and Huel overruled the orderlies in 2 languages and let me walk to the medical bay under my own power, which she later admitted was not medicine but testimony. She ran her scanners for an hour. The numbers were, in her words, disgraceful. Elevated everything, depleted everything else. Fatigued debt to a depth her instruments described with a negative sign she'd never seen them use. And tomorrow, she asked, watching the readouts. What does a human body do with this tomorrow? Complains, I said. Stiff for a week. Then it adds it to the file. It adapts, her eyelids cycled. It reads the debt as instructions. She turned off the scanner and stood there in the hum. Handler called her. I have certified athletes for 40 cycles. I am going to write the paper now, and the title will be very calm. And every physiology board on 6 worlds is going to lose its composure entirely. She did write it. The calm title was Sustained Load Performance in an Untrained Human Subject. The word that broke the boards was untrained, and she fought every referee who tried to make her cut it because it was the entire point. They kept asking what program had produced me. She kept submitting my shift manifests. Vrelik unlocked on the 2nd day. The seam recovery from a full shell lock takes that long, and he spent it upright at the 8th cradle by tradition. A locked champion stands where he locked, attended by his trainers and, for several hours that the feeds wore out from replaying, by a human cargo foreman who pulled a supply crate over and sat with him and talked, or mostly didn't. I'd brought 2 flasks of the garrison stew. I drank mine. I racked his where his eye stalks could see it. When the shell lets go, I told him it'll still be warm. Cook says the marrow settles by the 2nd day. Says it's better. He couldn't answer. Locked. One eye stalk dipped about a centimeter and came back up. From a cassock in full seas, chef informed me with something like awe, that is roughly a speech. The actual speech came at the medal ceremony, and I'd put it up against any document the authority has ever stamped. They hung the closing event medal on me. They had to lengthen the cord. It was sized for Kashyyyk, and the protocol then called for the outgoing champion to salute the incoming one, a formality, usually a claw tap and done. Vrelik walked to the rostrum, freshly unlocked, plate still dull from the heat bloom, and waved off the protocol officer, and addressed the entire garrison with the mess hall watching, and the freight decks watching, and, by the relay delays, eventually a respectable fraction of known space watching. 11 cycles ago, I won my first burden event, he said, and I have spent every cycle since learning to price an opponent at a glance. Mass, shell, stride. I have never been wrong by more than one burden. He let that sit. 26 days ago, in the garrison mess, I priced a human at the second burden, and I was generous, and the room laughed, and no one laughed harder than I did. He turned and picked up the 9th yoke, event mast, his scaling 2 days after a full lock, and the gallery sucked in air through 40 kinds of breathing apparatus. And he held it at rest the way you hold evidence, not trophies. I was wrong by 7 burdens, he said. Garrison, when next you price a human, begin from this. They are not strong the way we are strong. They are not fast the way the draws are fast. They do not need to be. The human does not spend himself because the human is not spending. He is simply continuing, and continuing is the only event the universe actually holds, and we have all of us been training for the wrong one. He set the yoke down, no chime, controlled to the last centimeter. I am told his species crossed their own oceans this way, rode, walked, and outweighted everything with claws. I am told they consider it unremarkable. His eye stalks found me in the front row. Handler called her. I retract the joke. It was a good joke, I said, because it had been, because the register of a thing matters and we were never enemies, him and me. We were the 2 professionals in the building. It was, he agreed. The timing was wrong, 11 cycles early, and the garrison laughed, and he let them. And that was the day the laughing on Sassin Ring finally landed where it had always belonged. Not on the human, and not really on the champion either, but on the pricing. Check paid out in person at her kiosk, with a line of spectators watching like it was a second medal ceremony. 410 to 1 on the whole provision stipend comes to a number I am not going to write down because my mother raised me not to discuss money, but I will report the relevant conversions. It cleared Check's reserve, 2 reinsurance layers she'd quietly bought after the exhibition, audit software, that one. She'd hedged me at 100 to 1 while still publicly quoting 400, and it came to more than I had earned in my entire contract on the ring. Worst line I ever posted, she said, counting it out, crest perfectly level. And the best advertisement this book will ever have. The clerk's payout is next. Tell him I am framing his slip stub for the kiosk wall, since he is framing the receipt. Pemmel's winnings, a month of an adjudicator's salary at the long odds, were enough that the authorities' ethics office opened an inquiry, and Pemmel, I treasure this, defeated the inquiry with a single filing demonstrating that his wager had been based entirely on public records that any official could have read at any time, and appending as evidence my tonnage ledger with the 30 years of Tuesdays itemized. The ethics office withdrew the complaint and, the story goes, 2 of its examiners stopped at the kiosk on their way out. And Article 40 got amended. This is my favorite paperwork in the galaxy. The entry rule that had flagged me, heavy tonnage handlers must be invited, was rewritten by an emergency session of the game's charter committee, and the new text, which Pemmel drafted and read aloud to me in his fee office with all his stamps absolutely still, reads, invitations under this article shall continue. However, no wager line on a human entrant in any endurance classification shall be posted without the notation human entrant. Standard pricing does not apply. It is, as far as anyone can determine, the only species-specific consumer warning in the charter of any athletic event anywhere, and the freight decks had it printed on mugs within a week. The aftermath ran on for months in ways I mostly heard about secondhand. The spin-spoke stairwell developed a population problem. At peak, Phipps counted 41 regular walkers of 9 species, and the maintenance union filed for a traffic assessment, and the authority, bowing to reality, installed water stations and renamed it on the deck plans. It says Calder Climb now. I have asked them to change it back. The form, Pemmel assures me, is processing. The comedy troupe retired the Wet Shirt Act and replaced it with one where a Cossack confidently prices a series of objects, a crate, a doorway, a small board human, and is wrong about all of them in escalating ways. I attended. It was genuinely funny, which the Wet Shirt never quite was, because now the joke was aimed correctly. Sava came down to Deck 6 before her transport shipped out, watched a half shift from the rail, and left having signed a 4-cycle contract as a courier on the express frames, where Draza's speed over short hauls is worth a fortune, and the shift structure, she informed her feed audience, trains the only thing my species lacks. Last I heard she'd finished a 6. Her people have started calling distance work doing Tuesdays. Huel claims responsibility. The manifests back her. Chef retired the slow leak impression on the record at a garrison dinner with full honors, the way you retire a banner. He performs it now exactly once a cycle, on the anniversary of the qualifying carry, by official request, including mine. Some things should be kept, so the young ones ask why. And Vrelik, garrison champion Vrelik, 8th burden record holder, first of his line, walks the Calder climb every 3rd shift, with a water drum, 60 liters standard harness, requisitioned through the quartermaster with a straight face. The first time the feeds caught him at it, they ran it as comedy. One last try at the old joke, and the clip died on the boards inside a day because everyone on Sessenring had already learned the new pricing. When something that strong starts doing something that patiently, you are not looking at a punchline. You are looking at next cycle's 9. He'll get to 2, or his hatchlings will. The Cossack are stubborn in the way of all good freight. It just took a human to show them the rate schedule. As for me, I worked out the contract. I gave the medal to the Deck 6 break room, where it hangs next to Pemmel's banner in a framed wager stub, and the crew touches it for luck before long shifts, which would embarrass me if I let it. On my last day, the garrison mess cooked the marrow stew, and the whole long room stood up when I came through with my tray, every species, claws and feathers and stamps, and nobody read anything aloud in a funny voice, and I confess I missed it a little. Vrelik walked me to the transport. At the lock he produced, from some ceremonial recess of that enormous shell, a gift. A chain link from the 9th yoke, the actual 9th, struck off and polished, heavy as sin in my palm. The Kos do not shake hands. He held out one vast polished claw very carefully, and I put my soft shellless, 54-year-old hand on it, and we stood there a moment, 2 professionals at the end of a shift. The wager money, he said. Chef insists I ask. The whole garrison wagers on what you will do with it, and no one will post a line because of the notation. There's a shed on a lake back home, I said, with a boat in it that's been waiting 9 years for an engine. His eye stalks contracted, the thinking look, pricing it one last time and knowing better now than to trust the first number. A boat, he said. And what will you do with this boat, little handler? Race it? No, I said, and shouldered my bag, and gave him the last of it. The whole secret of my species, free of charge, the thing the file always said in plain sight, just go out on the water every morning, for as long as I last. He was still standing at the lock when the transport pulled away, and I'd swear on the 9th cradle his seams were venting. Slow and even, 4 beats to the bar, the boat went in the water in spring, cedar on oak, engine sweet, bright work shining. It's early on the lake when I take her out, fog still on the water, and some mornings, pulling the stroke I could hold all day, I think about a polished claw in a mess hall laughing, and I row a little farther than I planned. Most mornings, though, I don't think about anything much. I just keep going. It's what we're for.